Hi, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and jump to this image. This is probably one of the most popular design thinking and team building activities. Many of you probably have played it or know about it. It's called the Marshmallow Challenge. And teams are provided, a little bit of hard spaghetti sticks, some tape, a little bit of twine, maybe some scissors, always a marshmallow. And they have a very short amount of time to create the tallest tower that they can. But each tower has to have a marshmallow at the top. And then you measure and see whose was truly the tallest. And there is a strange effect where they've done this so many times that they've been able to kind of analyze who does this well and who doesn't. And some of the worst performers at this challenge are actually business school students. And it's because they spend so much time orienting toward the problem or analyzing the problem and then vying for control. And so when time really begins to run out, they hastily build. And at the last minute, they'll try to put the marshmallow on top of the tower. And they stand in great contrast to the best performers of this challenge, who are kindergartners. And kindergartners really excel at this because what they do is they immediately start building small structures with the marshmallow on top. And they fail and they build iteratively. They just keep trying and trying and failing and trying. And the reason why I am kind of fascinated by this activity is because when it comes to issues of the future of learning and work, I feel like we can sometimes approach the challenge a little bit more like the business school students. And is it any wonder why? We're constantly bombarded by information that can seem almost paralyzing at times. Prior to the pandemic, if you had been following any of the trending conversations about the future of work, you would have noticed that there was some sort of new fact or figure that told us how many millions of jobs we might lose to robots or machines. So Frey and Osborne really did this in a dramatic way in 2013, where they scared all of us, saying that maybe 47% of the jobs in the US were at high risk of computerization. And then you saw companies and different organizations trying to play around with that number, saying, well, not all jobs will disappear. Maybe tasks will disappear, but that doesn't mean that a job will go obsolete. So Brookings came out and said, well, maybe it's more like 36 million jobs that might be at high risk of obsolescence because of AI. At the same time, you had futurists and experts on aging and longevity who were even suggesting that we could expect to live longer and that human lifespans would extend decades longer than we had anticipated. Already, we had many workers who were over the age of 55 staying in the workforce at historically high rates, well into their 60s and 70s. And we also had Census Bureau data that was telling us that early baby boomers were experiencing at least 12 different job transitions by the time they retired. And those job transitions have been complicated by technology's transformation of nearly every facet of our economy. It's forcing us to develop new skills and knowledge at a pace and on a scale never before seen. So we saw, for instance, that in 2014, LinkedIn's top jobs were jobs that really didn't exist 5 years prior to that point. They were jobs like social media intern or big data architect, UI UX designer, or iOS or Android developer, or a cloud manager. And so it was natural for us to wonder how many more as yet unknown jobs might we have to prepare for in a longer, more turbulent work life. Would 20 or 30 job transitions become the new normal? And yet, as uncertain as that world of work ahead appeared for all of us, all of those stats and forecasts kind of made the future seem like something we could analyze safely from a distance. It was something that we could solve for maybe 5 or 10 years out from now. And there really didn't seem to be great urgency about designing and building the infrastructure needed for that seemingly far off future, even though we knew, for instance, that our current system of traditional higher ed is really not well suited for continuous returns to learning. We don't do a great job of facilitating many on and off ramps in and out of learning and work. In fact, we usually have only one. If you stop out of college, you're stigmatized as a dropout and then you're punished with student loan debt. It's not designed for working adults. It's not designed for continuous returns to learning. At the same time, you had institutions really kind of perseverating on just that first transition from young adulthood to the workforce. And they've often been in this never ending debate about whether they bear any responsibility for the preparedness of graduates for the workforce. But all the while, we had a lot of newly minted college grads who had been struggling for years to get good jobs and accumulate wealth. So in a study that we did with Burning Glass Technologies, we actually found that we looked at 4 million unique resumes over a 10-year period. And we've often heard this idea of underemployment, right? That a newly minted grad goes and works at Starbucks or is selling clothes at the Gap, and we think, oh, that's just kind of a short-term problem. It's only affecting a small minority of the population. They'll find their footing soon. But what we found through this data and look at these millions of resumes was that actually newly minted grads tended to start off at a fairly high rate of underemployment. So 43% started off underemployed. And once you started off underemployed, you were actually 5 times more likely to remain underemployed 5 years out. And 75% of that group actually remained underemployed 10 years out. So that means they were in a job that did not actually require a college credential in the first place. And the odds for women were even worse, whereas men could often escape the rut of underemployment by majoring in computer science or engineering or even communications. Women were worse off no matter the discipline. So whereas 1 in 3 men started off underemployed, 1 in 2 women started off underemployed. And so it didn't even matter necessarily if women majored in a STEM discipline, with the exception of engineering, where they were equally less likely to be underemployed. For the most part, women were kind of a step behind throughout that 10-year period. At the same time, you have to remember the financial implications of this. We talked about how college grads were not accumulating wealth. One of the challenges is if you're underemployed, you are on average earning at least $10,000 less than your peer who is appropriately employed in a job that requires a college degree. And those effects really compound over time, not just the financial aspect of it, which is huge, but also the inability to develop that kind of professional network, to develop social capital, which we all need as we move through the workplace. At the same time, employers are not off the hook here. It was not just sort of the onus of institutions of higher ed to fill this void. Over the last few decades, we've really seen a retreat from employers in helping workers progress. So it was hard enough for new grads to actually make it into the workforce. And then once in, there were really limited ways for workers to progress. Wharton professor Peter Capelli tells us that in 1979, we actually used to offer approximately 2.5 weeks worth of training each year for newer employees. But then by 1995, that number really dwindled down to only 11 hours. And it was not about building new skills and upskilling an incumbent workforce. And so when faced with this option of whether to buy or build talent, the reflex of most employers has really been to look outside of the company, to recruit externally, to buy that talent rather than mold their existing workforce. So the question then becomes, how do we do a better job of preparing people for this uncertain world of work ahead? And so you hear a lot of pundits, you read a lot of the literature on the future of work, and there's this theme that comes out that says, well, the best way to focus on this is to cultivate our uniquely human skills, because that is what will help us coordinate better with the robots, complement their work, and especially acknowledge that there's just certain tasks that we do need to relinquish to computers because they will just outdo us no matter what. And we have lots of different names for these kinds of uniquely human skills. We call them soft skills or workforce competencies, baseline skills, professional skills. Whatever we call them, it gets at this idea of, communication, emotional intelligence, teamwork, collaboration. We hear these broad terms used very frequently. And in fact, when you actually look at the data, this is just from the first half of 2018. We looked at 36 million job postings. This was with MZ, the labor market analytics company that Al was referencing. And even in just 6 months, we can see that the top demand from employers of the skill that they really need circle around these human skills of communication and leadership. The problem, of course, is that just because I say I'm a good communicator and a job posting is requesting someone who has good communication skills doesn't actually mean that there will be some sort of magical connection and direct connection to a good job there, right? We all know that's not going to suffice. And so what we did was we looked at millions of graduates' trajectories in the labor market to see what these skills actually manifest as. So how do you break down this overly broad and not so useful term like communication and help people understand that actually it depends on what pathway you're going to go into. And it turns out we were looking here at millions of profiles of liberal arts grads in this particular study. And it turns out that the top 10 pathways that these grads move into are fields like marketing or HR or, behavioral health. And that one specific human skill of communication actually becomes something that's more like a human plus technical skill. It's not just a purely kind of generalist skill. If you actually want to demonstrate the skill of of communication in behavioral health, it might sound a little bit more like crisis counseling or crisis management. In marketing, it means that you better be good at storytelling and search engine optimization and brand management. In other arenas like in HR, you got to be ready to write an employee handbook and do internet recruiting and onboarding. These are what the skills actually translate into in the language of the labor market. And learners really need to know this as they try to navigate transitions. And these are also sorts of skills that you can't necessarily just acquire at the last minute. Sometimes they need to be embedded earlier on in a learning experience. The same goes for a skill like problem solving. We always hear how much employers are looking for creative problem solvers. But those specific skills look very different, right? It's about market research and forecasting in finance. In marketing, it may sound more like crisis communications or lead generation. In HR, right? It's succession planning and change management. There are these different skills that manifest, and they again kind of straddle this interesting space of those softer human skills as well as those harder technical skills. And this is really, really important, right? As we think about navigating transitions, because we tend to kind of move somewhat blindly as we try to navigate. And we think in bigger chunks where maybe if we want to go into a field like journalism, we assume we need to just be a really great writer and communicator, right? But what people need to understand is that the role of real-time labor market information can help us see that actually journalism now is a whole lot more like an IT field. So you better be ready to do some CSS and Google Analytics and work with something like Tableau for data visualization. You have to have these giant circles actually reflect the enormity of demand for these skills in just the field of journalism. And so what we have to understand is that these skills, as we prepare for the future of work, sound a whole lot like something we're quite familiar with, this idea of a T-shaped individual, right? Someone who has that broad-based knowledge with a little bit of that vertical technical expertise. But as we also try to reconcile all of that data we just talked about and how we're going to be facing that longer, more turbulent work life, this model is still not quite sufficient, right? Because in the future, we're going to have to develop and not only just broaden our human skills over time, but we're also going to have to dip back into some sort of educational pathway or learning experience where we can get just what we need in order to remain competitive in the workforce. Now, all of this is now further complicated by the arrival of the coronavirus. So when the coronavirus hit, our situation actually became a whole lot bleaker. because it decimated industries like retail and hospitality with massive layoffs and furloughs, and actually made it such that a person who was laid off couldn't just find another job in retail and hospitality. They had to move into a totally different industry. Um, and that's just something we were never prepared to do. We've never even been really good at helping people understand how truly transferable their human skills are across domains. We've never been good at facilitating people's pivots across industries. And so what we realized with the COVID crisis, right, is that our education and workforce infrastructure was completely lacking in responding to this massive crisis. And of course, the effects were distributed deeply unevenly across our citizenry. The people who have been, there's been this outsized impact on our Black and Brown communities. And we also have to remember that it's not like we didn't have problems in the first place. I like how author Daniel Pink describes the virus as the great unmasking of problems that were in plain sight. There were always these these fundamental cracks in the system. And indeed, long before COVID, we had over 40 million working age adults with a high school degree only who were falling through those fundamental cracks. They were not earning a living wage. They were 50% more likely to live in poverty than those with some college beyond high school. And they died at higher rates too. Ann Case and Angus Deaton have revealed jaw-dropping data about deaths of despair, how death rates have surged for white and Black people without a college degree across the age spectrum. And again, these grim prospects were all pre-COVID. And now with the pandemic, the bottom quarter of our wage earners, those who are making less than $27,000 a year, have lost almost 11 million jobs since April. And that's according to MacArthur Genius Award winner Raj Chetty. So we know that the future is here and now, and it's deeply unequal in impact. And those 11 million jobs that have been lost equal 3 times the number of jobs lost by the top quarter. And the challenge, of course, is that none of these numbers, or the millions upon millions of unemployment claims, even begin to account for the human cost of the problem, the real lives at the center. And so for all of these reasons, my team and I conducted hour-long interviews with close to 100 adult learners in this space. And our interviewees talked frequently about the hustle to survive and their inability to juggle education with everything else that seemed to work against them. And so I'm going to play a short video for all of you.
I feel like I could learn to do most jobs, but I understand the reality of the job market is you have to come in saying, I already know how to do this. No one's going to give you 6 months to figure out how to do a job.
I was laid off. And for the first time, the relevance of not having a degree became manifest, because even though I had years upon years, over 20 years of experience doing all these different things, the first question they were asking is, so where'd you go to school? The last time I actually had to go looking for a job, we did things like talk to people face to face, and that's completely gone now. And you just end up getting put into a slot. And as a result, they don't know who you are. They just look at, has he gone to school? No. So then you go into that pile.
Money. Because you don't learn how to finance when you're poor, you're poor. So you don't learn how to look, you almost ignore your finances. And I had to learn to look at them to be able to manage them. But that's a huge, overwhelming gap.
But I knew that in order to make a livable wage, at the time I think they were paying me like a little over minimum wage, which you can't live on if you wanted to. I needed to put something in front of my name or behind my name to, one, separate myself from being a criminal, and also to make me legitimate in some ways.
Generally, my routine was I didn't have a car at the time. I was riding a bicycle, and I'd put my children on the school bus for school and ride my bike and clean houses for the doctors and the dentists down in, in the high-end neighborhoods, and then ride my bike up to school and I'd, audio tape my classes and ride home and meet the kids and then let them play and cook dinner and do all those preparatory things that you do with children. And after they're bathed and they're sitting there, watching TV or relaxing before bed, I'd put my headsets, listen to my lecture again, and I'd be sewing wedding dresses at this long table that I had, and I would just be sewing dresses and listening to the lecture. On the weekends, I was driving a taxi.
I mean, when I went to orientation, it was crazy. It was overwhelming. I saw all these young people like sitting next to me, and I was like, I do not belong here. Like, what am I doing? These are kids that are coming out of high school, and I can be their mother. That's what I'm going to be in the classroom, and I really don't want to be that. Plus, I have experience, I have experience. I don't have a paper that can show that I have knowledge.
I can say yes or no. Have you ever been convicted? That question on the application, the box, right?
Yeah.
So that question comes up. So I'm just like, how am I supposed to succeed? Like, everything keeps you stuck. Like, you can only do so much. They want me to work doing construction, like mindless work, but that's not me. I can work with my hands, but my mind is not being fed. My mind needs to be fed for me to feel like I'm encouraged, like I'm involved in something.
People are working hard. People are working so hard. And people don't have opportunities that other people have. And it doesn't mean they're not smart.
It felt like punishment, just to try to get ahead. I have this go, get it spirit, but I was never in a position or given that supportive hope to keep going forward. You know what I mean? And I knew that's where I wanted to go, was forward.
The Greek word to incite means to put a flame underneath. And I want to incite some learning as well as some dreaming.
So often when we are in these conversations about the future of work, we often concentrate and focus on the what, the work, the number of jobs, the millions of workers. But really, what I'm trying to do with this book that I alluded to earlier is try to sort of shift our focus from the future of work to the future of workers, because the barriers that adults face coalesce around these issues that are going to ultimately be barriers for all of us. The folks who are being left behind today are emblematic of the lack of access to relevant information, support, advising, skills training that they need in order to advance. And so when we did these interviews, we realized that the themes really coalesced around a lack of career navigation to begin with. People don't have great access to assessments or ways of understanding who they are today relative to where they want to go. We don't have good ways of helping people understand their hidden credentials, right? We have very formalized education, but we don't have ways of understanding what kinds of skills we have accumulated over time when we have taken care of someone with Alzheimer's or driven a truck across the country thousands of times or built a family, right? We don't have ways to assess who we are. And so as a result, we don't have a way to envision our skills gaps relative to the pathways that we want to go to. We can't even understand that maybe we're 30% of the way there toward being a product manager and 80% of the way there toward being someone in human resources, and that we just need to acquire some of these specific skills. So people need better information about how to analyze who they are, but also how to choose the right pathways ahead, right? We have to remember that we have over 4,000 degree granting institutions in the US. We have, startlingly enough, we have over 700,000 unique credentials flooding the educational and labor markets, right? And so you would think that all of these options would offer learners a better selection of precise career pathways, but that sheer number of programs just creates more hiring friction between learners and employers. And so we need better ways of helping people understand which one will actually be affordable, cost effective, more precise, and get them moving along the way. And they also want to be sure that a future employer is going to validate whatever learning experience they choose. And they need these human touch points that kind of help guide them along the way. Some of this stuff can really be tech enabled, but a lot of folks need human touch points and supports. One of the biggest pieces of this is that icon that talks about wraparound supports. When we are talking about adult learners, especially ages 25 to 65, we are talking about people who have multiple part-time, full-time responsibilities. They're juggling raising kids or taking care of sick folks in their family or the elderly. There are a lot of things that get in the way of their pursuit of advancement. So what are the kinds of wraparound supports we are building into these on and off ramps in and out of learning and work? And what are also the more transparent, fair, skills-based hiring practices we can start to leverage in order to enable fair opportunities to good jobs? And if we kind of return back to this idea of this kind of T-shaped learner over, a 100-year work life, where exactly are we going to go to acquire these skills that we need? Sometimes it's actually not going to be some technical expertise. Sometimes we're going to be stymied in our career pathway because we haven't broadened some of those softer foundational skills that we need. How do we increase our emotional intelligence? Where do we go to do some of this work, right? And so it's really important that we kind of move beyond talking about micro-credentials or alternative credentials and really start to kind of leverage this really unique moment that we're in, where we have access to kind of treasure troves of digital breadcrumbs in the labor market, whether it's through job postings data, social profile and resume data. We need to look at the ways in which people actually move through the labor market to start to replicate some of these better pathways for people. So this is a piece that I actually wrote for the Harvard Business Review, where using some MZ data, we actually looked at thousands of workers in some of the hardest hit industries during this COVID pandemic to see how did they actually move prior to the pandemic from one stable job to another in a different field. And we looked at people who stayed in one job and moved to another for at least 90 days. And of course, like when you're looking at something like transportation, and I'll zoom in a moment, but when you look at something like transportation, you would expect that a lot of people tend to stay in transportation. Same with office admin. When people start in office admin, they tend to stay. But what we did in this project was actually looked at some of the more anomalous pathways that people took. So in this kind of broader zoomed out view, I just want you to take a look at these gray pathways. These gray pathways are really just meant to signal the people who stayed in the same field. What I wanted to look at was who were the ones who were actually making their way into different opportunities. And so it was really fascinating because when you took someone, for instance, who was in retail and hospitality, and you added on just a few more complementary skills, because we could actually see the skills they were building through their profile data. And you could see that they added skills like talent sourcing or payroll and benefits administration to the skills that they already had. They were actually able to move into better opportunities that paid better, right? And they could launch. And granted, when you look at these percentages, these are very, very small percentages of people who've actually managed to make the transition. And that's almost precisely the point. These are small, unique, idiosyncratic ways in which people are making a way forward, and they're almost fumbling their way through and doing it on their own. And there's got to be a better job. There's got to be a better way in which we actually take these labor market exceptions and make them more of the rule. And so with the help of training providers and education providers, a retail worker might be able to see, that they're 80% of the way there towards something else, or maybe 30%, toward an in-demand role as a network analyst. And with just a little bit more precise education, they can move along. And so, of course, I am not talking about sending people back for a 1-year certificate or a 2 or a 4-year degree. Because again, these are folks who have limited time and resources to put towards this mode of survival that they are in. So how do we move them faster along to something better? And again, we can all think of different solutions, providers, organizations that work in these spaces of career navigation, wraparound supports, targeted education, integrated earning and learning. This is a huge one where we somehow expect, we'll often dangle tuition reimbursement dollars as a human resources benefit for our employees, but most of those often go unused because it's really difficult to put the burden on the individual and to say, you skill up on your own on top of everything else going on in your lives. So how do we integrate learning on the job? How do we reimagine on the job training so that we are actually building new skills for our employees? How do we make it more work-based, hands-on, experiential, so that again, it's not something else on top of everything else? But all of these things, we can think of things that exist and we can think of great people who do work in these spaces. But if you were to just take any person off the street and just say, how would you navigate your job transition? Who do you call to make that job transition? None of these things actually come together in a seamless way and an easily accessible way for any sort of job seeker. And so the idea here is that we actually have to begin really doing the hard work of pinpointing these barriers and obstacles that make progress feel impossible today, because no matter who we are today and whether or not we already have a degree or a well-paying job, we are all going to have to return to learning throughout our work lives to learn and build new skills and transition between career fields. And when we do, we're going to bump into the same exact barriers, the same constraints on our time and resources, and the same limited options as the millions of Americans who are being left behind today. Our fates are actually interwoven. And it's something that we're all familiar with called curb cut effects. So the idea with curb cut effects is when sloping ramps and curbs actually became the new normal and became available in thousands of cities with the Americans with Disabilities Act, it didn't just benefit the handicapped or the disabled. It benefited mothers with strollers or parents with strollers or delivery folks with packages and dollies and bicyclists and runners. It's this idea of universal design. If we actually design something for the people who need it the most, it will actually benefit all of us. And so if we actually begin to invest in this infrastructure of a better learning ecosystem for the future, we can actually begin to stitch together the programs, the solutions that exist, and add on new solutions that can serve as engines of mobility for millions more Americans. So it's really time to stop admiring the problem, and it's time to build. Thank you.
So many things are running through my head right now because you are taking, again, a very humanistic approach. You're looking at the realities that people go through today, and the fact that skill acquisition has been kind of in this inertia of, okay, you go to high school, you go to college. If you don't go to college, you kind of make it up. And then there's this idea that employers are going to have the wherewithal through their systems, processes, technologies to find appropriately. So from a critical point of view, the process is very clumsy and inefficient. From a compassionate point of view, there's massive opportunity to really improve. However, all this takes systematic thinking. I've seen many leaders, like when we've discussed it, it's like, okay, they just get overwhelmed because you have to influence academic institutions, you have to influence individuals, you have to influence organizations, and still others, potentially even governmental organizations. So how to make sense of it all? I mean, if you want to advise, particularly HR leaders and those within organizations who are trying to make their organizations more efficient in terms of developing people and finding people, what would you advise to kind of wrangle all this seemingly overwhelming noise.
Yeah, it is, especially from an HR perspective, and you look at, attempts to widen talent pipelines and leverage things like pre-hire assessments. That in itself, right, is a wild west. But I think what we're learning from this current moment that we're in is that actually, and this comes from even as we started to build out our theories and try to figure out how we create a movement and build a movement towards behaving differently, because it does require a different kind of orchestration of people and organizations. We at first were thinking, oh my goodness, this is going to take a good 5-10 years to begin to gain traction. But the benefit of the pandemic is that it actually has brought the urgency and brought all of these issues to the here and now. And so I feel like there are actually a lot of different organizations who are coming out willing to behave differently and willing to build new coalitions and say, I'm willing to partner with groups that I never really would have partnered with, because not only out of financial duress, but it's finally time to kind of do something new here. I feel like we're in this, this is sort of the positive lens of the pandemic, where it is forcing these silos to actually break down somewhat and realize that every piece of this, when we're talking about employers and policymakers and funders and venture capitalists and social entrepreneurs, all these different silos that exist today are part of a very interdependent system, right? It's not just like if you blow up this system, it'll improve this other side of the labor market. It really requires a delicate kind of coalition building. And so I think there is this sort of new willingness to work together in new ways. And you see it in organizations like the Skill Up Coalition and different kinds of organizations that are doing this stitching together work.
Now, you mentioned the pandemic being a great opportunity to reinvent, and there's new call it crisis management teams that have been created to think about, okay, how are we going to take care of employees? That has turned into, okay, do we need all our employees now if our business is taking a hit financially in terms of how much it's going to sell and what the forecasts are and all this? So there's this work design, workforce planning that's happening. Some industries are recovering, others are still stressed. So my question pointedly is, if you're advising an enterprise, what would be your few points that you would say, okay, if you are going to be smart about attracting talent, developing talent, then you're going to do X? Is it around governance? Is it around systems? I mean, what are some of your ideas to ensure that organizations are being intelligent in terms of how they're nurturing talent, both inside the organization and out?
Yeah, so I think, for a long time, we've had this myth that if you invest in your talent development, that they may leave to a competitor or, and it's actually truly a myth. The data doesn't actually, there is no data to support these sorts of myths. And actually, as we go back to this data around the number of hours that we're putting towards building new skills for our people, most of these training and development resources are being channeled toward efforts around risk mitigation and compliance training. Again, it's not about building new skills. So as we think about it from the perspective of a job seeker who enters that workplace, what are we actually providing that gives them transparent understanding of how they actually move forward? What are the skills that they need to build internally so that they don't leave, so that we actually do reduce churn? Do they see the pathway ahead? And so I think that's why Amazon probably got a fair amount of attention around its idea of kind of taking 100,000 warehouse workers and upskilling them into not just their next job, but the next job in, data technician work. So learners need that career navigation internally within an organization to understand how they move ahead and and it's this idea of kind of a skills compass. Once I kind of know directionally where I want to go, what are the gaps I need to fill? So there are all these really interesting kinds of innovations coming out from MZ, SkyHub, FutureFit.ai, where they're trying to map out for folks, here are the skills you need to acquire, and here are here's access to an aggregated platform of different learning providers who actually do teach these skills. So we need to give people some more guidance instead of just saying, here's $5,250 of tuition reimbursement training, go get a degree, because that may actually not fill the needs of that particular employer. So I think it's really clarity and transparency around this idea of career navigation within. I think that's real low hanging fruit for employers to engage with their talent differently and help them understand that there is sort of this loyalty and this opportunity embedded in these in this skills building pathway.
Well, and just to phrase it a bit, I don't know, differently, just to amplify that, it's focusing on the employability or elevating the employability of workers, and not coming from a scarcity mentality, but from an abundance mentality. And to your point, is it the case where I, as an enterprise, I am going to provide the resources for them to actually become more employable beyond just, okay, here's some programs to tap into, but here's really some thinking, some frameworks, some models to, have choice over time and make sure that you're mitigating risk yourself. Is that a fair playback?
Yeah, so if I can give you two examples that completely play into what you just described. So in these kind of AI-based platforms that do this kind of skills gap analysis and skills building pathway navigation for folks, there's a group called Skyhive based in Canada, and they had gone to a Fortune 1000 company. And the company had these major goals for the future of the kinds of roles that they needed to develop more. But they had just laid off a certain number of folks. And when Skyhive actually looked at the profiles of those folks that they had laid off, what they realized is if they had not laid off a good, fraction of the folks that they did, they could have actually taken those folks and made them more employable, built up their skills so that they could actually serve the new goals of this transitioning company. In another one, in a company called Future Fit, what they're trying to do is work on outskilling. So if we think about kind of the budget line in most companies that are set for layoffs, what they're actually doing is taking those resources to build skills for the people who are about to be laid off so that they can have a successful transition into a different company. And that really benefits, it obviously helps in terms of optics, because the optics of a layoff are never great. But to build an employee's base of skills so that they can have a more successful transition in the future is a pretty phenomenal way of thinking about employability differently.
And if I'm hearing correctly, and this might be my own narrative, it's not only a virtuous stance that you're looking out for, the employee well-being and overall social responsibility, but it actually just makes good business sense. Is that a fair statement
Absolutely.
as well from your perspective? Yeah.
Yeah.
And so,
I mean, when you think about the cost of churn, it's deeply commonsensical.
yeah, I get, I think like many of us in the field of HR and people don't specifically get frustrated because the evidence is there. There's story after story, use case after use case, yet the world has not shifted in this regard very much, and certainly not enough given the realities of today that you've very clearly and eloquently described. Finance has largely made a decision, or even more broadly, those with a financial first mindset have made the decision, and that's been more about quarterly results and short-term thinking as opposed to the long-term ramifications both for the organization and society at large. So would you advocate that we need to apply some more systematic thinking to this problem so we're not just constantly chasing our tails, so to speak?
Yeah. When I talk to different employers who are very forward thinking about these kinds of human capital management and development ideas and strategic initiatives, they're incredible, but the question they keep getting from other board members or people across the organization is, well, tell me the ROI of this, right? Like bring it down to sort of a nugget or a number that will make this clear. And you're right that it does require some long-term thinking. But again, when it comes to this idea of constantly externally recruiting from the outside, that is just that's not a sustainable way of developing talent. So we have to kind of look around us in our local ecosystems to say who have we overlooked that we could actually mold into what we need.
Well, I have a couple more questions, and there's some nice compliments coming at you in the chat here. So, my question is going from the organization to the individual, and there's many who would contend that, hey, it's up to the worker to explore and find ways to develop themselves, and it's their responsibility. And if I, as an employer, are going to enable that, it's going to be for our direct benefit. And you just said, well, there's no guarantees towards that end. It might work out that way, but they also might go off and work elsewhere, potentially even for a competitor. But looking out for their well-being and employability has benefits. But ultimately, the individual has to have a different, more open mindset. You're not going to just go to college and get a degree in, physics and be a PhD physician. Well, no, it's not a physician. A PhD in work in physics for the rest of your life. In fact, earlier, David Yang is in our field, and he has a PhD in physics. So, what would you say to individuals to open their mind and take a very proactive approach to developing themselves in a way that is intentional, that helps them get where they want to go?
Yeah, so you're right. The burden is unfairly right now on the individual, and it's going to still be that way for quite some time as we start to build these coalitions. It's just going to take time. But I would look at some of the resources that exist, whether it's through Skillful or the Skill Up Coalition or onward.us, right? Like these organizations that are trying to begin doing some of the stitching together of both that career navigation piece, identifying some of the educational pathways and some of those more direct connections to employers. But it is unfortunately up to the individual right now, for the most part, to try to identify some of these more precise skills building pathways out there. I'm not sure. Sorry, what was the other part of your question now? I'm just trying to remember.
No, you're touching on it. It's the role of the individual, taking responsibility. And I'm curious as to, like, MZ had a tool called Find Your Calling. And I have two kids, 19 and 17, and they're at the outside of their career, and this is a conversation that I have with them, and as well as with many other young professionals. It's like, you're not putting yourself into a box. You're not going to be, if you graduate with political science, it doesn't mean you're going to be a politician. It doesn't mean you're going to work in that field. There's a variety of branches. So that is very intimidating. We as human beings arguably want certainty. We want to be confident about, we take that step, it's going to go in that direction, towards that outcome, towards that feeling. Yet the world is not providing that for us. So, what tools, what advice would you give individuals to be more confident about how they're developing themselves, so they're not spinning wheels? And one other thing I'll add on is, arguably, and I don't have data on this, but there could be a lot of mistrust in institutions right now, academic institutions, particularly as they're struggling to survive. For-profit colleges, obviously, that's been in the news over the past few years. So there's been huge investments made, and the return hasn't been there. So where do I go to mitigate my risk, so I know if I'm spending my time, energy, money, that I'm going to be employable, that I'm going to be able to get a job? So, what would you say in terms of tools and, ideas?
Yeah, so one of the kinds of skills building pathways is something we call an on-ramp, which is right now I think most of us are now familiar with these coding boot camps, right? That you kind of go into this immersive 6 or 12-week program, and then you might be able to get close to a six-figure job as a web developer or a front-end software developer. Sometimes they have them in data analytics. I think they're even building some in oil and gas. But it's these ideas of these kind of short burst training programs. And to date, a lot of those have been more geared towards more affluent people who could afford to pay out of pocket for these kinds of opportunities. And now with the emergence of things like income share agreements and different ways of sharing the risk, some of that is becoming a little bit more affordable for folks. But there's also a set of groups out there like JBS, Job Train, Perscolas, Year Up, Merit America, Icy Stars, Launch Code, these kinds of on-ramps that do this, anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, sometimes even longer, where they're building both the human and the technical skills for advanced manufacturing or cybersecurity, or healthcare, and they're moving people from that bottom quartile of our population into something better and something more stable. So there are real opportunities that exist. Unfortunately, again, like one of the things that we're trying to do is surface these solutions for people so it's not so hard to find. But again, that's just taking time. And so from the perspective of a job seeker who's really seeing, oh my goodness, this is all on me right now, I think it's really important to first question, is the degree truly the thing that will launch you? I think we tend to use that because learners have seen how that degree has been used as a proxy for talent. They just assume that they need to go to 4 years of night school in order to move ahead. I think what we're trying to develop now are some more bite-sized ways of moving people forward so that they can then kind of think about more of those long-term degree programs in the future.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. And those smaller chunks could be faster, less expensive, less risk at the end of the day. So, and more agile because it can adjust to, the needs of a particular employer. So, hey, Michelle, love the way you show up. Love what you have to share. Thank you so much. Before we sign off, you want to share a bit more about the book and where people can find you and access your great work?
Sure. Thank you just so much for inviting me out. It was a lot of fun. If you need more information about me, you can find me at riseanddesign.io. And then if any of you are interested in this book that's called Long Life Learning, Preparing for Jobs That Don't Even Exist Yet, it's actually available for pre-order now on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and Porchlight, a bunch of places. So yeah, please buy.
Well, I know what I'm going to be doing around Thanksgiving time in early December is I got another book to read, and I got Lars's book at the end of January. So yeah, I got a library building. But again, Michelle, super appreciate you contributing and look forward to seeing you in person, hopefully before too long. So be well. Thank you.
Thank you all.